Have you ever wondered what drives a person to abandon their humanity completely? What makes someone capable of looking into the eyes of innocence and choosing darkness? Stay with us, because what we're about to uncover will challenge everything you thought you knew about evil. Welcome back to another journey into the forgotten shadows of American history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this story spans one of the most isolated and haunting regions of the United States. The Appalachian Mountains have always held secrets, but none quite as disturbing as what unfolded in the winter of 1891. This is a story that historians have deliberately buried, that local communities refuse to speak about, and that will make you question the very nature of human morality. The year is 1891. The Industrial Revolution is transforming America's cities, but in the remote valleys of the Appalachian Mountains, life remains largely unchanged from a century before. These are communities built on trust, on mutual dependence, on the unshakable bonds of faith and family. It's in one such community, a small settlement called Hollow Creek in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, that our story begins. Hollow Creek wasn't much to look at. Maybe 40 families scattered across a valley, connected by dirt paths and the occasional cleared road that became impassable in winter. The nearest town of any size was Pikeville, a full day's ride away on horseback. People here were subsistence farmers, miners, and trappers. Life was hard, but it was honest. Everyone knew everyone else. Children played freely. Doors were rarely locked. It was the kind of place where a stranger stood out immediately. So when Reverend Isaiah Marsh arrived in October of that year, he was noticed. He came down from the northern trail riding a sturdy bay horse with saddlebags that looked well-traveled but not worn. He was a man in his late 40s, with gentle eyes, graying temples, and a soft-spoken manner that immediately put people at ease. He wore simple black clothes and carried a worn Bible that looked like it had been read 1,000 times. The settlement had been without a proper minister for nearly 2 years. Their previous pastor, Reverend Hutchins, had died of pneumonia the winter before, and the isolation of Hollow Creek made it difficult to attract new clergy. The arrival of Reverend Marsh seemed like an answer to prayers. He introduced himself to the community elder, a man named Tobias Webb, explaining that he had been called by God to bring ministry to isolated communities. He said he had served congregations in Virginia and North Carolina, but felt drawn to Kentucky's remote valleys where spiritual guidance was desperately needed. Tobias, a devout man who had mourned the loss of their church's leadership, welcomed Marsh with open arms. Within a week, Reverend Marsh had conducted his first Sunday service in the small wooden church at the center of the settlement. His sermon was beautiful, eloquent without being pretentious, filled with hope and compassion. He spoke about God's love for the forgotten, for those who lived far from the centers of civilization. He made each person feel seen, valued, important in God's eyes. After the service, people lingered to shake his hand, to welcome him properly to their community. Marsh was invited to dinner at different homes throughout his first weeks in Hollow Creek. He always accepted with gracious humility, sharing meals with families, listening to their stories, offering gentle counsel. He had a particular gift with children. They seemed drawn to him naturally, crowding around after services to hear him tell Bible stories with animated gestures and warm laughter. He established a small Sunday school, teaching reading and scripture to the settlement's youngest members. Parents were grateful. Education opportunities were limited in such isolated areas, and having their children learn to read through Bible study seemed like a double blessing. Marsh spent hours with the children, patient and kind, never raising his voice, always encouraging. The settlement school teacher, a young woman named Emma Pritchard, observed these sessions with approval. She had been trying to expand literacy in the community for 3 years with limited resources. Having an educated minister who could help felt like providence. She began coordinating with Marsh, sharing books, discussing teaching methods. A friendship developed between them, professional and respectful. But there were small things, barely noticeable at first, that might have given someone pause if they'd been paying closer attention. The way Marsh's eyes would linger on certain children, particularly the quieter ones, the more vulnerable ones. The way he would find reasons to visit homes when he knew fathers would be away, working in the mines or hunting in the mountains. The casual questions he asked about family situations, about which children had living grandparents, about which families had extended networks versus those who were more isolated. In November, Marsh approached the Webb family with a generous offer. He wanted to establish a more formal religious education program, he explained, but it would require dedicated time and space. He proposed converting a small, unused cabin on the Webb property into a schoolhouse specifically for religious instruction. He would personally fund the necessary repairs and materials. All he asked was permission to use the space 3 afternoons a week for intensive Bible study with selected students. Tobias Webb was deeply moved by the offer. The cabin had belonged to his deceased brother and had been sitting empty for years. To see it transformed into a place of learning and worship seemed fitting. He agreed immediately, and work began within days. Marsh hired local men to make repairs, paying them generously from funds he claimed came from his previous congregation's support. The cabin was cleaned, reinforced, insulated for the coming winter. New windows were installed. A small wood stove was added for heat. Bookshelves were built along one wall. It looked perfect, a cozy sanctuary for learning. What no one noticed was that Marsh also added something else. A heavy bolt on the inside of the door. Thick curtains for the windows that could block out all external view. And in the small back room, originally used for storage, he installed a sturdy lock on the outside. The religious education program began in early December. Marsh selected 8 children for the initial group, ranging in age from 7 to 12. He explained to their parents that he chose students who showed particular aptitude and interest in religious studies. The sessions would be every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday afternoon, lasting about 2 hours. The parents were honored that their children had been selected. They sent them off proudly, never suspecting that they were delivering their most precious treasures into the hands of a predator. The first few sessions were exactly what they appeared to be. Marsh taught scripture, led discussions, assigned simple memorization tasks. The children came home excited, talking about what they'd learned. Parents asked them about the lessons over dinner, pleased with the detailed responses they received. But during the 3rd week, something changed. Little Mary Sullivan, age 8, came home quieter than usual. Her mother, Grace, noticed immediately. Mary had always been talkative, bubbling over with stories about her day. But that evening she was subdued, picking at her dinner, avoiding eye contact. Grace asked what was wrong. Mary hesitated, then said the Reverend had taught them a special lesson about keeping God's secrets. She said some things were too holy to share with others, even parents, because they were special communications between a soul and God. Grace found this a bit odd, but she was not well versed in religious education. Perhaps this was normal. She didn't push further. Over the next few weeks, several of the children in the program began showing similar changes. They became more withdrawn. Some started having nightmares. Others developed anxious behaviors, becoming clingy or fearful. Parents noticed but attributed it to various causes. The harsh winter settling in, the natural challenges of growing up, perhaps just fatigue from the extra schooling on top of their regular chores. Nobody connected these changes to Reverend Marsh because he remained, in every public interaction, the perfect picture of pastoral care. He continued conducting beautiful Sunday services. He visited the sick and elderly with genuine-seeming compassion. He counseled couples having difficulties with wisdom and discretion. He was becoming beloved, an integral part of the community. What was actually happening in that converted cabin was something no parent could have imagined in their darkest nightmares. Marsh had spent those first weeks carefully grooming his selected victims, assessing which children were most vulnerable, most likely to remain silent, most isolated from protective networks. He tested boundaries gradually, watching for reactions, adjusting his approach with each child individually. He used his religious authority masterfully. He told the children that God spoke to him directly, that he could see their sins, that he alone could save them from damnation. He mixed genuine religious instruction with psychological manipulation so skillfully that the children couldn't distinguish between legitimate faith lessons and abuse. He created a system of secrets and shame, convincing each child that what happened in the cabin was their fault, their sin, their burden to carry. He told them that if they spoke about the special lessons, they would be punished by God, their families would be shamed, and they would be responsible for destroying their community's faith. Torture was methodical. Marsh understood that physical abuse alone could be discovered, but psychological control, spiritual manipulation, the weaponizing of faith itself created a prison with invisible bars that kept his victims silent even as they suffered. One child, a 10-year-old boy named Thomas Garrett, tried to resist. During a session in January, when Marsh began one of his special lessons, Thomas stood up and said he wanted to leave. He said this didn't feel right, that his father had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts were screaming at him to run. Marsh's demeanor changed instantly. The gentle pastor vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He told Thomas to sit down. His voice carried an authority that made the boy freeze. Then Marsh began a calculated assault on Thomas's psyche that lasted nearly an hour. He told Thomas that his resistance was proof of Satan's influence, that his family was in spiritual danger because of Thomas's sinful nature, that Thomas's father, who worked deep in the mines, could have an accident at any time, and it would be Thomas's fault for inviting demonic forces into their lives through his disobedience. Thomas was just a child, raised to respect religious authority, terrified by the specificity of Marsh's threats. He sat back down. He didn't try to leave again. And that night, when he went home, he said nothing. The shame and fear had already taken root. But something inside Thomas was broken that day. Over the following weeks, his personality changed dramatically. The cheerful, energetic boy became sullen and distant. He stopped playing with other children. He had violent nightmares that woke his parents several times a week. His father, Benjamin Garrett, grew concerned and asked Thomas what was wrong. Thomas wanted to tell him. The words formed in his mind 100 times. But every time he tried to speak, he remembered Marsh's threats, the promise of his father dying in the mines, the certainty in the Reverend's voice when he said God would punish the entire family for Thomas's sins. The boy carried this impossible burden alone, and it was crushing him. The winter of 1891 to 1892 was particularly brutal in the Appalachian Mountains. Snow fell almost constantly from December through February, isolating Hollow Creek even more than usual. The religious education sessions continued without interruption because the cabin was close enough to the main settlement that children could walk there even in harsh weather. Marsh's confidence grew. He began taking greater risks, keeping children longer, becoming more explicit in his abuse. He had created such effective psychological control that he believed himself untouchable. 8 children trapped in his web, none of them speaking, all of them suffering in silence. But he made a mistake. A small one, but in a community as tight-knit as Hollow Creek, small mistakes could have large consequences. In late February, Emma Pritchard, the schoolteacher, was walking past the web cabin on her way home from the main schoolhouse. It was late afternoon, just after sunset, and she noticed lamplight through the curtained windows. She knew Marsh conducted his final session on Fridays, and it should have ended over an hour ago. She wouldn't have thought much of it except she heard something. A sound through the walls that stopped her in her tracks. It was a child crying. Not the normal cry of frustration or minor injury, but something deeper. A sound of genuine distress, almost despair. Emma stood there in the snow, uncertain. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, that the Reverend's lessons were his private domain. But that sound troubled her. It triggered every protective instinct she had developed during her years teaching children. She moved closer to the cabin, careful to stay out of sight of the windows. She could hear Marsh's voice now, low and intense, speaking words she couldn't quite make out. Another child's voice, pleading. Then silence. Then the sound of the interior bolt being drawn back. Emma quickly moved away, hiding behind a nearby tree. She watched as the door opened and one of the children, Sarah Webb, emerged. Even in the dim light, Emma could see the girl's tear-stained face, her hunched posture, the way she hurried away from the cabin as if fleeing something terrible. Emma's instincts screamed that something was very wrong. But what could she do? She had no concrete evidence, just a feeling. And accusing a respected minister based on a feeling would make her look foolish, perhaps even malicious. In communities like Hollow Creek, questioning religious authority was nearly as serious as questioning God himself. She decided to watch more carefully, to pay attention, to trust her instincts while gathering actual information. Over the next week, Emma observed the children in her regular schoolhouse with new awareness. She noticed things she had previously dismissed. The way certain children flinched at unexpected movements. The way they seemed to withdraw into themselves. The way they avoided talking about the religious education program, even though they'd been enthusiastic about it initially. She made a point of speaking individually with several of the children, casual conversations that seemed natural. She asked gentle questions about what they were learning, how they felt about the extra lessons. The responses troubled her. They were too rehearsed, too careful. These children were hiding something. Emma knew she needed help. She couldn't investigate this alone without raising suspicions. She needed someone trustworthy, someone with authority in the community, someone who would take her concerns seriously, even if they seemed far-fetched. She chose to confide in Benjamin Garrett, Thomas's father. She had noticed Thomas's dramatic personality change, and as a teacher, she felt responsible for the well-being of all the settlement's children. Benjamin was known as a level-headed man, protective of his family, but not prone to rash judgments. She visited the Garrett home one evening when she knew Benjamin would be back from the mines. His wife, Martha, welcomed her in, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table, drinking coffee. Emma chose her words carefully, explaining her observations without making direct accusations. Benjamin listened with growing attention. Martha's face grew pale as Emma described the children's behavioral changes. When Emma mentioned hearing a child crying in distress from the cabin, Benjamin's jaw tightened. He admitted that Thomas had been struggling, having nightmares, becoming withdrawn. They had attributed it to the stress of growing up, perhaps the harsh winter affecting his mood. But now, hearing Emma's concerns, a terrible suspicion began forming in his mind. Benjamin asked if he could speak with Thomas privately. Emma and Martha agreed, and Benjamin went to his son's small bedroom. Thomas was already in bed, but not sleeping. He rarely slept well anymore. Benjamin sat on the edge of the bed and did something he hadn't done since Thomas was much younger. He put his hand on his son's head, gently, protectively, and said something simple but profound. Thomas, I need you to know that nothing you tell me will ever make me stop loving you. Nothing you've done, nothing that's been done to you, nothing at all. You're my son, and I will always protect you, always. Something in those words, in the gentleness of his father's touch, in the absolute certainty of that promise, broke through the walls Marsh had built in Thomas's mind. The boy began to cry, and then, in a torrent of words that came out almost incoherently, he began to tell the truth. He told his father everything. The manipulation, the threats, the abuse. The way Marsh had used God and Scripture as weapons. The way he had made Thomas feel responsible, ashamed, terrified. The way he had threatened that speaking out would destroy their family. Benjamin listened to every word, his heart breaking with each revelation, his anger growing into something cold and focused. When Thomas finally finished, exhausted and shaking, Benjamin held his son and made a new promise. He said he would make this right, that Thomas had done nothing wrong, that the evil was entirely Marsh's, and that no harm would come to their family. Martha had been listening from just outside the door, tears streaming down her face. When Benjamin emerged from Thomas's room, she saw something in her husband's expression that she'd never seen before. It wasn't just anger. It was a father's absolute determination to protect his child, regardless of the cost. The three adults spoke quietly in the kitchen for hours. They discussed what to do, how to proceed. They knew that accusing Reverend Marsh would be explosive. The community loved him. Many would refuse to believe it. And in isolated communities like Hollow Creek, there was no real law enforcement. The nearest sheriff was in Pikeville, a day's ride away, and winter made that journey dangerous. They decided they needed more evidence, more testimony. If Thomas was a victim, the other children in the program almost certainly were too. They needed those children to feel safe enough to speak. Benjamin and Emma developed a careful plan. Emma would speak to each child individually during school, in a private, gentle way. She would let them know they could trust her, that she believed them, that they would be protected. Benjamin would speak to the other parents quietly, carefully, preparing them for difficult truths. 3 days, Emma had gentle conversations with 6 of the 8 children in Marsh's program. She didn't push or demand. She simply created space for truth, assuring each child that they were safe, that they had done nothing wrong, that the adults in their lives would protect them. One by one, the children began to speak. Each story was heartbreaking, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Marsh had been systematically abusing all 8 children, using slightly different psychological tactics, with each based on their individual vulnerabilities. The pattern was clear, methodical, and absolutely damning. By March 3rd, 6 families knew the truth. The pain and rage in those households was nearly unbearable. Parents who had trusted Marsh, who had sent their children to him believing they were providing opportunities for growth and education, now understood they had delivered their babies into a predator's hands. A meeting was called. The 6 families, plus Emma Pritchard, gathered at the Garrett home late one evening. The discussion was intense, emotional, and focused on one question: what to do with this information. Some argued for immediate confrontation, for dragging Marsh out of his home and delivering frontier justice. Others insisted they needed to follow proper legal procedures, to ride to Pikeville and bring back the sheriff. Still others worried about the community's reaction, about the children being subjected to public scrutiny, about the trauma of a public trial. It was Tobias Webb who made the most painful decision. His granddaughter, Sarah, was among the victims. The abuse had happened in a cabin on his property, with his permission and blessing. The guilt he felt was crushing. But he was also the community elder, the person others looked to for guidance. He said they needed to act carefully but decisively. They would confront Marsh privately first, give him a chance to confess. Then they would decide together as a community how to proceed. He argued that transparency was important, that hiding this would only create more shame for the victims. The group reluctantly agreed. They would confront Marsh the next day after Sunday service, when the entire community would be gathered anyway. But someone in the group made a critical error in judgment. That night, consumed by rage and perhaps by a desire to protect his own child from the trauma of public testimony, one of the fathers decided to take matters into his own hands. His name was Jacob Finch, and his daughter Lucy was 9 years old. Jacob was a coal miner, a hard man made harder by years of dangerous work underground. He had heard Lucy's testimony that evening, heard her describe things that no father should ever have to hear about his child, and something inside him snapped. Just after midnight, Jacob left his home carrying his hunting rifle. The settlement was asleep, dark except for the occasional lamp in a window. Jacob walked through the snow toward the small house where Marsh was staying, a guest cabin owned by the Webb family. He kicked in the door, rifle raised. Marsh was asleep, but woke instantly, sitting up in bed with surprising calm despite the violent intrusion. Even in this moment, even confronted by an armed man radiating fury, Marsh's first instinct was to manipulate. "Brother Finch," he said, his voice gentle, concerned, "what troubles you? How can I help?" Jacob's response was not verbal. He grabbed Marsh by the front of his nightshirt and dragged him out of bed. He shoved him against the wall and pressed the rifle barrel against Marsh's chest. "My daughter," Jacob said, his voice shaking with rage, "told me what you did, what you've been doing." For just a moment, Marsh's mask slipped. Jacob saw it, a flash of something cold and calculating in the man's eyes. Then the mask returned, but it was too late. Jacob had seen the truth. "I don't know what the child told you," Marsh began, But surely you know that children sometimes misunderstand. Jacob hit him. The rifle butt struck Marsh's face with enough force to drop him to the floor. Blood poured from his nose. Still, Marsh tried to maintain control. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said through the blood. "I am a man of God. I have done nothing but serve this community with love and—" "Shut up," Jacob said. "Shut your lying mouth. I know what you are. We all know now." It was at that moment that Benjamin Garrett and two other fathers burst through the broken door. They had been worried about Jacob, had followed him, arriving just in time to prevent what might have become a murder. They pulled Jacob back, took the rifle from his hands. But they didn't help Marsh. They stood there, these three men, looking down at the bloodied minister on the floor, and their faces showed no sympathy. Benjamin spoke with cold clarity. "Tomorrow morning, after service, you will stand before this community and confess what you've done. Every detail, every child. You will face what's coming to you like a man, or we will drag you to Pikeville in chains. Either way, your time here is over." Marsh, sensing the shift in power, tried a different approach. He began to cry, false tears that might have worked weeks before, but now only disgusted the men watching him. "Please," he said, "I'm sick. I need help. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I tried to resist these urges, but I'm weak. I'm flawed. I need—" "What you need," Benjamin interrupted, "is to face judgment. Human judgment first, then God's. And I suspect God's will be far harsher than ours." They left Marsh there on the floor of the cabin, but posted guards outside to ensure he didn't try to flee during the night. The settlement was small enough that news traveled fast. By dawn, everyone knew that something serious had happened, though the details were still unclear. Sunday morning arrived with heavy clouds that promised more snow. People gathered at the church as usual, but the atmosphere was tense. Word had spread that there would be an important announcement after the service. Marsh did not conduct the service. Instead, Tobias Webb stood at the front of the church and addressed the congregation. His voice was heavy with pain and shame as he explained what had been discovered. He told them about the abuse, about the children who had suffered in silence, about the predator who had hidden behind the cloth and collar. He named the victims with their parents' permission, giving them the dignity of being acknowledged rather than hidden away in shame. The reaction in the church was explosive. Disbelief, horror, rage, and grief erupted simultaneously. Some people wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. A few shouted demands for immediate action. Then Marsh was brought in, escorted by the fathers who had guarded him through the night. His face was bruised from Jacob's blow, but his eyes darted around the room, still calculating, still looking for an angle. Tobias gave him a chance to speak, to confess, to show any hint of genuine remorse. Marsh stood before the assembled community, these people he had deceived and betrayed, and he made one final attempt at manipulation. He spoke of his illness, his weakness, his supposed struggle with demons he couldn't control. He quoted scripture about forgiveness, about how Jesus himself welcomed sinners. He wept and begged for mercy, for understanding, for a chance to seek help and redemption. But the community had heard the children's testimonies. They had seen the evidence of calculated predation. They knew this was not weakness or illness. This was evil, pure, and methodical. A vote was called. What should be done with Reverend Isaiah Marsh? Send him to Pikeville for trial? Deliver immediate justice themselves? Exile him into the mountains and let nature take its course? The debate was intense. Some argued for legal process, for allowing the law to handle it. Others pointed out that trials could take months, that the children would be forced to testify publicly, that Marsh might find a way to manipulate the system as he had manipulated their faith. In the end, the decision was made by the victims' families. They chose a path that was not strictly legal, but felt more immediate and certain. Marsh would be taken to the boundary of the settlement's territory and exiled. He would be given minimal supplies and a horse, and told never to return. If he was ever seen in Hollow Creek or its surrounding areas again, he would be killed on sight. It was not the justice the children deserved, but it was the justice the community could live with. It avoided the trauma of a public trial while still removing the threat permanently. That afternoon, in falling snow, Reverend Isaiah Marsh was escorted to the Northern Trail. He was given a horse, a blanket, and enough food for 3 days. Then he was told to ride and never look back. As he mounted the horse, Marsh turned one last time. The mask was finally gone completely. The gentle pastor had vanished. What remained was something cold and hollow. "You think you've won," he said quietly. "You think you've protected your children. But people like me, we're everywhere. In your churches, your schools, your communities, you can't see us until it's too late. You can never really protect them." Benjamin Garrett stepped forward, looked Marsh directly in the eyes, and spoke the final words. "Maybe so, but we can make damn sure you never hurt another child. Now ride, before we change our minds about letting you live." Marsh rode north into the gathering storm. The community watched until he disappeared into the snow and darkness. They never saw him again. They would haunt Hollow Creek for generations. The children who survived Marsh's abuse carried those scars for the rest of their lives. Some found ways to heal, building families and lives despite the trauma. Others struggled, the damage too deep to fully overcome. Thomas Garrett grew to adulthood, married, and had children of his own. He became fiercely protective, perhaps overprotective, teaching his children to question authority, to trust their instincts, to understand that evil could wear any mask. He lived to age 73, and on his deathbed, he told his grandchildren the full story, wanting them to understand that vigilance wasn't paranoia, it was wisdom. Emma Pritchard left Hollow Creek 2 years later, moving to a larger town where she could continue teaching. She developed a reputation for unusual attentiveness to students' well-being, for noticing signs that others missed. She never spoke publicly about what happened in Hollow Creek, but her actions suggested she carried those lessons with her always. The community itself changed. The easy trust that had defined life in Hollow Creek before Marsh arrived never fully returned. People became more cautious, more protective. The religious education program was discontinued permanently. When a new minister eventually arrived, he faced intense scrutiny and was never quite fully trusted. The cabin where the abuse occurred was burned to the ground one night. No one claimed responsibility and no one asked questions. Some violations of sacred space can only be cleansed by fire. As for Marsh himself, his fate remained unknown. There were occasional rumors over the years of a former minister matching his description showing up in other isolated communities, but nothing was ever confirmed. He vanished into the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, perhaps dying in the harsh winter, perhaps moving on to victimize elsewhere. The story of Hollow Creek was not recorded in official histories. There was no trial, no newspaper coverage, no formal documentation. It existed only in the memories of those who lived through it, passed down quietly through families as a warning, a reminder that evil is not always obvious, that trust must be tempered with awareness, that protection requires vigilance. Looking back over more than a century, we can see patterns that should have been recognized sooner. The isolated location that made Marsh feel safe to operate, the position of authority that granted him access and trust, the careful grooming of victims and the community itself, the systematic psychological manipulation that kept children silent. These patterns still exist today. Predators still seek positions of trust and authority. They still choose vulnerable targets. They still use psychological control to maintain silence. The tactics may evolve, but the fundamental dynamics remain disturbingly consistent. The story of Hollow Creek is not unique. Throughout history, throughout the world, predators have hidden in plain sight, using the very structures meant to protect and nurture as tools for abuse. What makes this story significant is not its uniqueness, but its representation of a larger, ongoing problem. The children of Hollow Creek deserved better. They deserved a world where trust didn't come with such risks, where innocence was truly protected, where the symbols of faith and authority couldn't be weaponized against the vulnerable. We cannot give them that world retroactively, but we can learn from their suffering. We can recognize the warning signs. We can believe children when they try to tell us something is wrong. We can question authority when our instincts scream at us to do so. We can prioritize protection over politeness, safety over reputation. The Appalachian Mountains still stand, silent witnesses to countless human stories, both beautiful and terrible. The valley where Hollow Creek once thrived is now largely abandoned, reclaimed by forest and time. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. Stone foundations marking where homes once stood. An overgrown cemetery with weathered markers. The remnants of a small church, its roof collapsed, its walls slowly being consumed by vegetation. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, some say you can still hear echoes. Not of Marsh himself, but of the community that came together to stop him. Of parents choosing to believe their children. Of a teacher trusting her instincts. Of ordinary people finding the courage to confront extraordinary evil. That's the real lesson of Hollow Creek. Not that monsters exist, we've always known that, but that ordinary people, flawed and frightened though they may be, have the capacity to recognize evil and stand against it. It's never easy, it's never without cost, but it's always necessary. If you've stayed with us through this difficult journey, thank you. Stories like this are hard to tell and harder to hear, but they're important. They remind us that history's shadows hold lessons we ignore at our peril. If this story resonated with you, if you believe these forgotten chapters of history deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to our channel. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts or other dark histories you think should be explored. And most importantly, if you're someone who works with children, who has children in your life, or who simply cares about protecting the vulnerable, carry these lessons forward. Be vigilant. Trust your instincts. Believe those who try to tell you they're in danger. The shepherd of Hollow Creek wore a false face and used sacred words as weapons. But he was stopped by ordinary people who chose courage over comfort, truth over denial. That's a legacy worth remembering. Until next time, stay aware, stay compassionate, and never forget that the price of safety is eternal vigilance. Thank you for watching.